Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. We have back with us today meteorologist Greg Soulje. And you may recognize Greg from being with us on past 365 segments, or perhaps you've caught one of Greg's forecasts on This Week in Agribusiness on RFD TV and a number of other stations across the nation each week. Welcome, Greg. Thanks for joining us. Great to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Pleasure to be with you guys once again here. And it's this will be a delight. We'll take a look at the winter outlook and hope everyone is gearing up and prepping for their Thanksgiving holiday. And we'll talk about that and how this El Nino-driven weather pattern will play out here this wintertime season. Some folks might be hearing other headlines, and how dare them watch any other ag or weather-related broadcasts around here. We've heard terms of a super El Nino, a mega El Nino. We'll maybe temper some of the language down and kind of get you a straight skitty here as we move on through the next few months.
Get us in the know. So let's start with the drought. I mean, that's something that we all need to keep track of, and give us an update. What are we seeing out there?
Yeah, well, this is the last week's drought monitor. Of course, that thing will get updated probably on Friday because of the holiday. But in any event, at the expense of really harvest delays, we've seen improvement through Michigan and Ohio, significant improvement through sections of northern and central Illinois. A little more work to go in that I-70 corridor, the eastern Corn Belt on southward. But harvest delays. But that's the trade-off. You're juggling moisture in the ground before it freezes up. Before you get snow and ice on the ground. And so the recent rain and snow through Michigan has been a big help through Ohio as well. But there's still like 40% of corn still standing out there in Michigan. Beans have done a little bit better, but everyone else over the rest of the eastern Corn Belt, by and large, and especially that western area, are wrapped up for the season. It's a pretty good example of what happens when you get dry weather, dry grounds. Crops are a little bit compromised, stalk and root systems as well. You can get out there early enough, and they've done just that. Where the epicenter of at least the Corn Belt drought continues on into Iowa as well as southeastern parts of Nebraska. Note roughly, though, you get outside of Norfolk and Omaha and west of the Red River, big improvement through that upper Missouri River basin back across much of the northern and central Rockies. Some work to do still in the winter wheat areas of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, but the southern branch of the jet, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, should help and mitigate some of the effects of drought there. And you can see, Sarah, that bullseye of red and orange down through Louisiana and Mississippi. Now, they had several reports of downed trees, power lines, a couple of touchdowns on tornadoes a couple of days ago, but an inch or two worth of rain. So there should be modest improvement there. But again, it's the southern states that are really in the worst of it. And it's amazing to see out through California, little or no drought. Just remember a year ago and even 2 years ago when that state was plastered in nothing but extreme or exceptional drought conditions.
Right. They were watching where the water table was at and where those lakes were at and everything else. So what are we talking about in terms of drought relief? Is there anything on the horizon here in terms of additional? We've had a little bit here and there, but what about overall?
Yeah, just enough to, if we can take a look at the forecast from the feds here, and this was put out at the end of the month of October. You can see that little green stripe, that moss green stripe, and that's basically coming into fruition where there's some localized, modest improvement to dryness and drought expected here over the next 2 or 3 months into Kansas and Missouri. That might be a bit optimistic from the feds, but that's their take on it. We do agree with Texas and at least parts of the southern plains expected to see improvement. Everyone else basically holds sway. If not that, then they'll probably worsen. And that is sometimes a trademark of El Nino. And probably if this El Nino continues to play out the way we see it, it's something that we'll have to monitor through the Corn Belt areas that have seen some improvement of late. One little side to that, Sarah, is these river levels in the Mississippi basin. They continue to be dramatically low. And unless we can get the storm track overhead, that may be a worsening story. And there's certainly issues as well down through areas like Memphis and New Orleans, where the Delta region, lower Mississippi Valley, is at low levels as well. So another part of the equation that has to be figured out as we go deeper on into the wintertime season.
Yeah, we thought we were seeing some improvement there in the Mississippi River levels a couple of weeks. Well, I guess the last time that we spoke about a month ago, and now we're just still seeing that it's not quite where it needs to be. So what about current weather patterns overall?
Yeah, well, going forward here over the next several days, we had this map up the past couple of times, and just think of it as winds up aloft and everything basically moving from west to east, almost a streamlined look. And you can almost at times see two somewhat fragmented branches to the jet. One, as you can see, buckling its way out of the Canadian prairie through the Corn Belt into the northeast of New England, and a separate little almost slingshot effect that's making its way through California, the Rio Grande of Texas, across the Gulf Coast and in through Florida. So that's what we get sometimes in these El Nino setups. And sometimes stronger events like this one will really help to deviate and separate these two branches. One contains Arctic air, which will be the groundwork for what we take a look at on temperatures here in the coming weeks. And we'll get a little flare of wintertime. Yeah, all these El Nino patterns are not strictly based on mild and warm all the time. And then that southern branch you see rippling through Mexico, the Gulf Coast area, that tends to be the moisture maker. And so you can see over the next 5 days, there's cold air in sight for much of the country. It's a drier weather pattern as well. So no real hope, no real significant snow or rain. So maybe some opportunities to finish the harvest in the far northern and eastern Corn Belt locales. And we think any weather systems that come on through, as you'll see probably in the next panel as well, they'll tend to really originate out of the desert southwest, make a run through the Rio Grande Valley, the Gulf Coast, maybe the far southern end of winter week, and hopefully generate some meaningful rainfall across the Gulf Coast and some of those worst drought areas of Texas and Louisiana. Apart from that, on the next panel, you'll see over a precip as we kind of melt down snow over the next 7 days, or rainfall in the Gulf Coast, just as we talked about in that I-10 and I-20 corridor out of eastern Texas and through Florida, a wet pattern there. And there'll be some accumulating snow where there's, I think, about 10% of the country, which is a bit below average for this point in late November, only has snow on the ground. That's really up near the Great Lakes region and then northward into the southern Canadian prairie. That blob that you see through Nebraska, Kansas, into the central Rockies, that will likely be some upslope accumulating snow. So at least, Sarah, it's moisture, it's snow. It helps to insulate the winter wheat fields, but at least that's the next inkling of a little organized moisture, likely to be organized snows for parts of the Central Plains back into the central divide country, that is, over the next 5 to 7 days.
And travel in the Midwest looks to be okay for this long Thanksgiving weekend, but maybe as we get a little farther out west, there might be a few issues, as you indicate, maybe a little snow or such. So little airline delays perhaps too, some places. But
yeah, well, there was a lot of action, the past 24 to 36 hours up and down the eastern seaboard. The central Appalachians had a significant snow, the northeast of New England. So it's in that corridor. And, outside of this little area across the middle part of the country, I think everyone will be in relatively good shape here for the Thanksgiving holiday period.
So what's your forecast? What else is going on, Greg?
Well, we'll take a look at some of the medium range thoughts here on some of the next panels. Well, first, a quick check here on that snow cover. As you can see, we normally ought to have at least a few inches from about Rapid City over towards maybe Watertown, South Dakota, to the Twin Cities, to Green Bay and northward. We don't. We see it mainly in the northeast of New England and southern Canadian prairie. Now, going forward from this chart here, we'll see how things play out in the steering currents up aloft over the next 7 to 10 days, back to those green squiggly lines. And again, everything is projected to move from a west to east orientation. The more compact those winds are, means the systems will move along. Anytime you get these big upper level, what we call ridges or troughs, the U-shaped bending to the winds up aloft, that's usually storm development. And we don't have that. Things are just moving along, lickety split. You look up through the Canadian Rockies and northern and central Rockies, where those winds in the lower levels come down off the mountains. That's what we call compressional warming. Folks who know and how to work equipment and motors and do all that kind of repair shop in the equipment shed know that when you compress a gas, you warm it. Same with the atmosphere. So that's a little indicator that while there's cold air in sight, generally speaking, the real Arctic stuff is not in particularly in sight here over the next 5 to 7 days. So some good news there. And we can see that on the next few panels here on the ranges of the next 6 to 10 days and perhaps even 8 to 14-day panels. Yeah, temperatures are a little more December-like. You can see the precipitation pattern is fairly quiet as well. Nothing of significance. As we talked about, that southern branch of the jet in a normal classic textbook. For now, El Nino keeps the wet weather down south of the Metroplex, Gulf Coast, south of Atlanta, down into Florida. So that's the next 6 to 10 days, on to the next 8 to 14 days. And there's really not much of a significant change. The cold air is kind of slowly working its way east. It's more of a progressive weather pattern, as we just talked about on that chart that had the green lines, the steering currents, the winds up at about 25,000 feet. They come down over relatively bare grounds. They come down off the mountains, and temperatures in December terms warm. And we'll begin to see that across the Dakotas, Red River Valley of the North, as we get into the early days of December. And the same on the precip outlook there. Not a lot going on. Again, focused through Texas, the Gulf Coast, southeastern parts of the country. Some indication that we'll get into a wet weather pattern in California. But Sarah, it's an El Nino. It's a moderate to strong one, but not your classic. I think, as I tried to discuss with Mike Pearson, it's not your classic atmospheric scientist look at El Nino from a textbook standpoint year for El Nino. I'll put it that way. It's going to have some deviations to it, and we'll take a look at that as we get into the longer range of forecast here down the line.
I want to take a minute here, Greg, to just remind everyone who's tuning in today that if they have any questions, feel free to post those in the chat for Greg. Or if you're on social media, you can post those right there in your social media channel. So I'll let you continue with your forecast and what we see ahead.
All right, and moving right along in those maps and charts there. Here's, you have seen this before on This Week in Agribusiness, and thanks to our friends over at Pivot Bio. This is the start of the winter outlook here, and this is the first 10 days of the month of December. And yeah, things are pretty much straightforward. This is really a no-brainer. We'll just let the El Nino set up and the winds up aloft dictate. And so the last of this kind of early season cold should actually be on the wane within the first week to 10 days of the month of December, maybe a little more energy usage into the northeast of New England for folks who monitor those markets. Livestock chill ought to be at seasonal levels for much of the Midwest, and probably some softening grounds and snow melt getting underway. Whatever we come up with the next 5 to 7 days west of the Missouri, we'll see that begin to transpire in the first week to 10 days of the month of December. And onto the precipitation, and not a lot going on. Look at this ridge, this arcing wind pattern from the Pacific Northwest into the Northern Plains, down southeast into the Corn Belt. That's a ridge. That's also indicative of winds coming off the Rockies and Canadian Rockies as well. So it's a drier setup. A couple of clipper systems may come through there, maybe nothing of significance from a winter storm standpoint. Again, the organized moisture in 2 areas where we could go for more of it. The Pacific Northwest, not much going on. Southern California, the desert Southwest, welcome moisture for the south end of winter wheat, Oklahoma and Texas, and over the southeastern portions of the country as well. Now, going from there into the remainder, at least the mid-stretch of the month of December, a little troughiness, and that usually allows for cold air to work in. And so we see a little bit of a downward push and pressure on temperatures out of the Canadian prairie down to about the Iowa-Missouri border. Nothing out of control, and we do not anticipate a lot of snow on the ground. That should help to temper the degree of cold. Cold air masses like to migrate over heavy snow-covered areas. If we don't have the snow cover, the cold is a lot more manageable. Meanwhile, over the southeastern portions of the country, warmth there and some ridging over the western sections of the nation as well. And the precipitation pattern, not a whole lot to really speak of. We'll get a couple of systems to kick out over the southern end of winter wheat up the Ohio Valley to the northeast of New England. I suspect there'll probably be some degree of snowfall. These do not look to be big Armageddon major winter storms coming out of that trough position. And again, quiet weather pattern roughly from about the divide or up to the upper Missouri Valley and westward to the Pacific coast. And so there you have it through mid-December. If we take it through the rest of December, yeah. And now this is kind of, again, a deviation from what we anticipate El Nino to be around here. There will be these occurrences of cold. We anticipate El Nino to be kind of on its wane as we get deeper into the winter season around here. And again, and while we clock in at winter time on the 21st, it ought to begin to look and behave as such in the second half of the month of December, with a pretty good slug of cold coming across the northwestern 2/3 of the country. Meanwhile, that upper level wind pattern, that trough, that U-shaped configuration over the middle part of the country gets you this kind of moisture pattern. And it's going to be probably a busy one with moisture expected to be pretty far reaching, including the likelihood, obviously, at this point of the season, of a snowfall for the northern and central plains, much of the Corn Belt into the northeast of New England and back across the Pacific Northwest. So, Sarah, there you have it, at least through the month of December. A little bit of everything for everyone, a manageable setup. And again, it's a give and take scenario from tending to livestock to maybe finally wrapping up field work and getting some of that much needed moisture in the ground and on the ground to protect, especially those winter wheat fields over the northern and central plains.
No major threats, it sounds like, and maybe even a little bit of a white Christmas.
Yeah, again, trying to keep everyone happy, and including the big guy up north. So we'll see what transpires there. But that's our thinking through the month of December.
So what's your overall winter outlook look like?
All right, we'll take it here a few steps further, and yeah, we'll take us all the way through the mid stretch of March, and here it is. See, from the accounts that I see and other forecasts I see, it's just not lining up to be your classic textbook mild and warm, warm and dry, all the moisture down south, et cetera, so forth and so on. So here's a pretty good slug. This would take us through the end of from the end of December to about mid-January, and the weather pattern begins to take on a little more robust, almost early to mid-winter look around here. Systems from the Pacific Northwest into the Southern Plains, they make their way up the Ohio Valley, and that's a pretty impressive cold air shield out of the South Central Canadian prairie. And of course, there'll be already snow on the ground. We'll add to that snowpack, and these cold highs like to migrate over the snowpack areas, and you come up with this particular setup as well. Just a wave after wave of impulses dropping in fairly weak out of the Pacific Northwest. They move into the Southern Plains. They move up the chute across the Ohio. So you wanted your moisture for the Mississippi and river streaming systems, but it's going to come down in the form of snow and ice and a pretty busy weather pattern expected, especially as we get going right into the first half of the month of January. So be ready for that. Now, going forward now from mid-January to mid-February, the cold air kind of relinquishes a little bit of its grip across parts of the country, a little bit of a northward retrogression on it. It's a fast jet stream pattern. It's still trying to orient itself out of the Pacific Northwest through the Central Rockies and points north and northeast, but not in the classic El Nino setup. When we watched these El Ninos and began to understand them back in the mid to late 70s, they were these typical Pineapple Express features out of Hawaii into California through the Southern Plains and points to north and northeast. But we now know that when you take into other indicators off the Pacific to the North Atlantic, polar regions, this Madden-Julian index that we watch around here and our methodology is forecasting, this is not going to be your classic textbook El Nino setup, especially if it's going to be in the wane or weakening as we get into the mid and especially late wintertime season. So there you have it from a temperature standpoint, and readings will be all over the place here on the Bank and Barn and vehicle thermometer from Kansas into the mid-Atlantic region. Now, the storm track for the remainder of January into mid-February plays out like this, pretty busy, and that will mean some meaningful snow. So for the Dakotas, much of the Corn Belt into the northeast of New England, again, kind of polar opposite, if you will, from what a normal El Nino weather pattern is. Normally drier, warmer, at least in this stretch here as we see it, heading on through mid-February across the northern parts of the country. And of all places, we're back at a dry time in Southern California, the Southwest, and parts of Texas, the Gulf Coast, when in some instances, when the right parameters are set on up, an El Nino like this will typically get that storm track more into the southern United States. So that's the peak here through mid-February. Now, if we take it from mid-February to mid-March across the country, now beginning to see a little more of a typical conclusion to El Nino. It's still hanging on, but we anticipate probably a reprieve, if you wanted to call it your January thaw in the midst of mid-February, mid-March. So here it is. But again, this is not your typical normal classic textbook El Nino setup going on. So there's a thaw going on and some snow melt too, and at least it easing us some of the harsh cold out of the northern plains, upper Midwest to the northeast to New England. Temperatures a little above average over the southeastern part of the country. Now, under that ridge, we anticipate the southern branch to keep cloudiness and probably some tendency for moisture as well over the southern reaches of the country. Matter of fact, that precip panel does bring moisture back into California, the Southwest, Texas, the Gulf Coast. So the main steering currents and those purple arrows, or the jet stream pattern, if you will, are riding into California, up into the Canadian prairie, then through the northeast of New England, and kind of a subtle southerly branch, almost like we're experiencing now, will come back into play on the back third of wintertime and generate some moisture for California and the far southern states and southeastern parts of the country, which probably by then, Sarah, we would have seen maybe a reintroduction of some drier areas in California, certainly certainly, if we can't get this going in any meaningful sense, the dryness of drought continues on as we're starting to ramp up field work in Texas and Louisiana and the Delta region, the same in the southeastern part of the country as well. So maybe some field work delays, but at the same time, moisture coming. And so considering we need the moisture, I think there's reports of fires in some of the island areas of Virginia and eastern sections of the Carolinas too. It's been so dry out there, the absence of any tropical systems during the course of the tropical season.
So when you talk El Nino and you're talking about precipitation, are we talking perhaps more rain than snow, or is there a balance there? What are we looking at?
Probably at the onset here, I think as we get into these busier weather patterns, there'll be a tendency for mixed moisture over to rain, and the snow likelihood of these coverages and the amounts, the propensity for call system snowstorms will be probably absent. Now, as we saw in some of those panels, we would get deeper into the mid stretch of winter. Yeah, with that cold air, the Arctic air laying out, the El Nino really beginning to wind down. I think there'll be a better likelihood to see some organized snows out of the plains, the Corn Belt locales as well, the Canadian border and points east from there. But again, it's a trade-off. You need some insulation for those winter wheat fields, pasture lands. You want to get some semblance of a normal snowpack and hope for a weather pattern that's formidable with getting spring rains, but an easing of snow melt. And so you bring back those river levels as well into the Missouri and Mississippi River valleys as well, too.
So how long do you see the El Nino pattern staying in place?
That's really the big $64,000 question. It's ebbed and flowed. It's been back and forth. It's probably about almost at its strongest that we've seen here over the past 18 months or so. And there's no real substantial weakening anticipated till we get just beyond the month of December around here. Then it begins to take on a little more of a weakening phase, and probably no real return to what we call a neutral state atmosphere until we get into sometime late winter or early springtime around here. So. But we're not chasing ping pong balls around in the atmosphere. There's a lag that occurs, and so that's why we may officially bring it into an El Nino or a La Nina or a neutral state atmosphere. But the effects of the atmosphere still may linger on for 3, 4, 5, 6 months at a time. So that's our thinking around here. It kind of goes back to some of the methodologies that we were brought up with a gentleman by the name of Earl Finkel, stuff that we've developed around here in-house as well. And I'm sure Max and Orion can certainly share stories about Earl. In any event, that's the way we see it around here. So, not your classic textbook El Nino year. We'll get into our winter business around here. And if you were to just lump sum everything and just say, pile it all into one 3-month time frame, well, probably about normal to a little above on temperatures, and maybe moisture that would be normal to a little bit below. But that is so just benign of a forecast. It doesn't tell you anything. So that's why we try to take this approach both this way and on This Week in Agribusiness as well.
Very good. And you're going to start putting some slides together for us on a monthly basis as well for feed stuff. So you can start,
exactly.
Folks can start checking that out too. That'll be about the first of every month. We'll have some Greg Soulje outlooks coming out in Feedstuffs daily, as well as on feedstuffs.com. So
that's
we're
right.
Looking forward to that, Greg.
And these updates as well, which we'll work on the technology for you. I'm a radio guy here, can't you tell?
You do great. No, we
Thank
appreciate
you.
all your maps and all the information. So there you have it, everybody. Greg's forecast, maybe temperatures a little above and precipitation a little below. That's what I got out of it, Greg.
You know what? If that's what you need to talk about in the water cooler, you've got the forecast correct. Everything else, we'll just worry about it down the line.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. Great to see you. We'll catch up with you then in next month.
All right. Have a great one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Likewise, we appreciate all of you for tuning in today and spending some time with us. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 segments are available on feedstuffs.com. Simply go to feedstuffs.com and click on the Feedstuffs 365 in the nav bar, and you can watch whatever sessions you like, including this one. Or you can catch Greg each week, of course, on This Week in Agribusiness. We appreciate you being here. Until next time, for Feedstuffs 365, I'm Sarah Muirhead.